Let's take a look at our Chapter 2 notes for ecology. First of all, we need to know what ecology is, and it is when we look at organisms, their environment, and how they interact with not only their environment, but with the other organisms within their environment. That's the study of ecology. Ecologists can do a couple different types of research. Number one, they can do qualitative research or they can do quantitative research. Qualitative research is also known as descriptive research, and it is when you gather information by your observations. This is usually when we're listing behaviors of organisms and things like that. Quantitative data is data that when we are taking measurements and we're doing experiments, sometimes in the lab and sometimes out in nature. An example of this would be counting the number of times an organism does a particular behavior while you are observing that organism. When we start to think about levels of organization and levels of where organisms live and what makes up different parts of these levels of organization, we have to first think of the biosphere. This is the portion of the Earth that actually supports life. It's the whole planet up to as far as life can exist. There are two different types of factors that you have to look at when you're talking about ecology. One is abiotic, a being our prefix that means not, bio being our prefix that means dealing with life. So abiotic is not living. So these are non-living factors in the biosphere. Now these factors, and this is really important, determine which species survive in a particular environment. So here you see a picture of a thermometer. Temperature, precipitation, that type of thing is an example of abiotic that actually dictates what organisms are going to live in that area based on those factors. The other type of factors that we want to talk about are biotic factors. We know bio means dealing with life. So these are the living factors. These are the materials within the ecosystem that are not only living, but also that once were living. So for example, in this picture here, we have our butterfly, which is living, right? And then we also have our leaves and our twigs, which are actually dead, but we consider them to be biotic because they were once living. So let's talk about our levels of organization. Atoms are the smallest unit of matter. They're the smallest unit that still possesses the properties of an element. We know that we can split atoms and such, but when we split them, they don't still have all the properties of that element that the atoms make up. Next is when we have one or more atoms that come together, they will make molecules. The smallest unit of life of all living things are cells. And these are the smallest unit that can keep the characteristics of life. So they are the functioning unit of living things. They can still respond to stimuli, they can undergo homeostasis, and those type of things. Next, we have like cells that come together. They perform the same function and they make up tissues. If I then take several types of tissues that perform a specific function, those make up organs. When I have organs working together to perform a specific function, that becomes the organ systems. The organ systems all come together to work together, and that becomes an individual living thing or an organism. So please make sure you know those levels. Now, if I have a bunch of the same organisms that live in the same geographical area and they belong to the same species and they can interbreed and live together at the same time in the same area, we call that a population. Here are some examples of two different populations. Community, these are all the populations of the different species that happen to be living in a particular geographical area at that same time. That makes up a community. Here's some examples of communities that in different areas, different grasslands, and we have mountainous areas. Our ecosystem is when we take our populations in our community and all the abiotic factors in that environment, and that makes up our ecosystem. So it's the interaction between the living, the non-living, the different populations, and these can be terrestrial, which means land, or aquatic. Next is our biosphere. This is composed of all the different ecosystems on our planet, because the biosphere is the area that can hold life or sustain life. So when we have different organisms in ecosystems, they have different habitats, which is the area in which the organism lives, the actual geographical area in which the organisms live. A niche is the role that an organism plays in an environment. It's how it interacts with its biotic and abiotic factors. It is kind of like the job that it entails within that. And when we watched our battle at Kruger with the buffalo and the lions and the alligator, crocodile, we saw the different roles or the niche that certain individual organisms played within their population. So we're going to talk about the three different types of symbiosis. Now remember, sim means together. Bio is living. So these are organisms that live together. And they usually have a close and somewhat permanent relationship between the organisms, and they're usually they are different species. The first type is what we call mutualism. This is an association which benefits both species. So species 1 gets a benefit from it, and species 2 gets a benefit from it. Here are some examples of this. This is where one of them is we have our raspberries down here, and birds will eat those raspberries and they get the benefit of the food. Then they poop out their feces, and in that feces are the seeds of those raspberries that hopefully get dropped and put back into the ground where those seeds can grow. Another one here is we have our moth that goes into the flower, and it is going to get the pollen out of there for its food, and then it's going to fly off, and then it's going to drop that pollen and where it can pollinate other flowers and other plants. That's mutualistic relationships. It benefits both. The second type is what we call commensalism. And this is where it benefits one species, but it does not affect the other species at all. So species 1 is benefited, species 2, there's no effect, whether positive nor negative. So here's an example of this is our clownfish living in our anemone. These are our little burrs right here that get attached to us, and they don't hurt us or anything, but as we walk or as they get attached to animals and as they walk, they drop all those seeds down there. Here we have our bird here that's going to eat all of the little insects off of our cow. The last type of symbiotic relationship is parasitism, a relationship in which one species benefits and the other is harmed. Now, we're familiar with that in terms of mosquitoes, tapeworms, and things like that, where it is hurting an organism, but it's helping itself. So those are the three types of symbiotic relationships, and you need to know all three of those for your test that we're having. Next, we're going to talk about nutrition and energy flow. So we need to know, how do organisms get their energy? And we know that getting energy and processing it is a characteristic of life. Our producers, which are on our first trophic level, our largest biomass of organisms, are what we call autotrophs. We know auto means self, troph feeding. So they are able to feed themselves. They make their own food. This is an organism that makes its own food for an ecosystem. A consumer, which we call heterotroph, which means different, it has to feed off of different things. That's a consumer, a heterotroph. And these guys have to get their food from other organisms, such as our lion here I think it's after a zebra right there, and our caterpillar. So we have our producers and we have our consumers. Now, the type of heterotrophs or consumers we have are called herbivores, they eat plants, carnivores, flesh, Omnivores, both. Scavengers are going to physically um, decompose or break up dead organisms, and decomposers will chemically break down dead organisms. So, those are the type of consumers or heterotrophs. Remember, our autotrophs are called producers. So, the flow of energy in this ecosystem is that this energy flows through each one of these, and they are recycled through different biotic and abiotic factors. So let's talk about our biotic factors. Let's talk about the energy flow amongst our living organisms. So we can have either food chains or food webs. And our food chain is really just a very simple relationship in which energy moves from producers to consumers to decomposers. And we're talking about just one organism and one thing that that organism eats, and it's very simple. Please remember that the arrows go into the mouth of the organism that's going to eat it. So that means, if I'm looking over this picture here, the frog is jumping into the mouth of the owl, which means the owl eats the frog, not the frog eats the owl. Trophic levels are our different feeding levels. So first we have our autotrophs. That's the level that makes their own food. Then we have our first order of heterotrophs, which eat our autotrophs. Our second order of heterotrophs eat our first order of heterotrophs. So our first order of heterotrophs eat our autotrophs. Our second order of heterotrophs eat our first order of heterotrophs. Third order of heterotroph is going to eat our second order of heterotrophs. Our food web is a little more complicated than our food chain that we talked about. It shows all of the feeding relationships in an ecosystem. Organisms usually eat more than one thing, so it shows everything that that organism eats in that ecosystem and all of the organisms that are getting their nutrients. So here's an example of a food web where you can see here that our red-tailed hawk here eats mice. It also eats golden-crowned kinglets. Our golden-crowned kinglet eats a pine borer, but our golden-crowned kinglet can be decomposed by our decomposers as it dies. So you notice that it's much more complicated than that simple food chain that we saw before. Now, our ecological pyramids, they show different factors. And it's in the shape of a pyramid because it represents several decreasing factors. One increasing factor, but several decreasing factors. And so the first decreasing factor that it indicates is energy transfer. So first notice at the bottom level of our pyramid here, we have our energy of our producers. That's 100% of our energy. Only 10% of what is available is going to be transferred up to the next level. So the primary consumers that eat these producers, they're only going to get 10% of the energy from our producers. Our secondary consumers that consume our primary consumers or eat our primary consumers is only going to get 10% of the energy that is available from the primary consumers. So in this scenario, it would be 10% of, you're only going to get 10% of this amount of energy. So it would be 10% divided by 10, which is going to be 1%. That means our tertiary consumers that feed off of our secondary consumers are only going to get 10% of the 1% that is available. So that's 0.1% energy. So each level as you go up, one of the decreasing factors that are talked about there is the decrease in energy. So that's the first thing here, the decreasing energy. It just says that each transfer energy from one organism to the other, some energy is lost as heat, so only 10% of the available energy is transferred to the next level. We can still account for all 100% of it, knowing where we lose it at heat and things like that. But the amount that gets transferred to that organisms is only 10%. The second decreasing factor that is shown is the decreasing biomass. Biomass is the total weight of an organism at each trophic level. So if we go back up at our bottom level, our consumers, we have the most biomass because we have the most of them to make their own energy. At the tertiary consumers, we have the least of them. Why do we have the least number of them? Because they have to eat so much to be able to survive. So that's the number that's going to be able to survive. So decreasing energy, decreasing biomass. The other decreasing component is the population size. The further you go up on the food chain, the smaller the population, because again, it takes in so little energy from the level below that it has to eat so much to survive that there's a less number of them. And here is an ideal pyramid of net productivity. So if we have 1 million joules of sunlight, 10% of that will get transferred to our primary consumers that use that to make food, make their own food. That leaves 10,000 joules there. Only 10% of that can get transferred up to our primary consumers that eat those, and that would be 1,000 joules. Only 10% of that can get taken up to our secondary consumers and would make it 100 joules. Only 10% of that can get taken to our tertiary consumers, which eat our secondary consumers, and that would bring it to 10 joules. Make sure you know and understand that for the test. So now we've already talked about the energy flow in terms of biotics, living organisms. So now let's talk about it in cycles of nature. First, we have our water cycle. We have evaporation, where the heat in the sun causes the water to evaporate and then to go into a gas state and rise. Transpiration is the evaporation of water from the surface of plants. Then the water can condensate, and then as it condensates and gets closer together, we have precipitation, where it comes down as snow or rain. Now in class we talked about how humans can influence the water cycle. Here's a great picture of the water cycle so you can see where everything is happening, where we have our groundwater that can then go into our lakes and our streams, infiltration of that water coming down. We have surface runoff right into our lakes. We have evaporation from the land and water that goes up, transpiration from the plants, get into our clouds where we have condensation, and then the precipitation comes down. The next cycle we want to talk about is our carbon cycle. This is important because carbon dioxide enters the atmosphere as a result of respiration of animals. It's a byproduct of us making our energy and other animals making their energy. So the plants use that CO2 for photosynthesis, which is the process by which they make their food. Synthesis make by light, by using light. So animals can eat plants and they use the carbon for growth. Then when the animals die, the carbon is returned to the soil by decomposers. And we talked again here about how humans influence the carbon cycle. Here's a great picture of the carbon cycle, how it all kind of filters through. Next is our nitrogen cycle, which is really important because plants eat animals and use nitrogen to make proteins, which is essential to animals living. Our bodies need proteins to be able to function properly. So animal waste and the actions of decomposers put nitrogen back into the atmosphere. Bacteria convert that nitrogen into a form that plants can use, which is really important because plants use that nitrogen to make proteins, and then animals eat plants and use the nitrogen to make protein there. So plants and animals, we have to have that protein to be able to function. Again, in class, we talked about how we as humans influence that nitrogen cycle. The last cycle we're going to talk about is the phosphorus cycle. Plants get phosphorus from the soil, and they can also get it from fertilizers and things like that. But the animals get the phosphorus from plants, and they use it for growth. It's what we use to grow. Decomposers then return the phosphorus to the soil. We talked in length about algae blooms and how humans influence that phosphorus cycle. Here's a great picture of the phosphorus cycle. Now, these are all the different nutrients and matter as it floats, as it cycles through. So make sure that you understand how energy flows and how matter is cycled.